Portia, and today I'm going to talk about why Gatsby is great or amazing for documentation. I am an owner of SEO Digital Agency. It's an agency where we specialize in creating technical documentation. So I've been in tech for a while, and I got my start spending my afternoons installing and reinstalling Ubuntu onto my machine. Well, one day it's in Ubuntu, the next day it's Little Ubuntu, which is light Ubuntu, and the next day it was Mint. So I had a lot of fun installing and reinstalling Linux operating systems on my machine. And if I became stuck, if I needed help, I often referred to the man pages. The man pages is a form of documentation. It's in your terminal. And so, for instance, I think you just use help. So if I wanted to know more about the mv to move command, I could just do mv / help, and then I'll be able to know more about the usage, and I'll be able to get like more information about the mv command. So in terms of this documentation being available, it gets a very high score for that. In terms of usability and being able to parse through the documentation, it did leave a lot to be desired. But there's this theme, like whenever I was using Linux or whenever I was using Python, that my relationship with a technology started with documentation. That's kind of how I became obsessed with it. Another thing that's sparked my interest in documentation, I worked at a lot of startups, and I spent time in a lot of hackathons. So this is ETH Berlin. I think this was like 2 years ago. ETH Berlin is a wonderful hackathon if you're into like blockchain stuff. But anyhows, what I've noticed with these hackathons, like the people who usually win the hackathons, not only do they have a really amazing app, but they also have like really good documentation or really good explanation about how to use their app and what kind of problem it solves. I just think this is so important because I have so many brilliant friends who start companies, and those who are having trouble, like one of the main problems they see is that they're not really able to communicate how to use their applications. So for me, with documentation, I really want to enable like really bright and brilliant people who put their technical apps out there in the world to be able to get an audience and get a community to understand like how that app is going to be able to solve their problems. So that's like another reason why I got really into documentation. So in this presentation, we're going to learn, of course, why Gatsby is great for docs. In that, we're going to cover the concept docs as code, working with video and images, and we are going to finish out the presentation by talking about documentation and the importance of robust SEO. Like, it's important for people to actually find the documentation that you spent so much time writing. So first, docs as code. The docs are out of date. This is a pretty common problem with documentation, unfortunately, when you look at especially a tech company. Documentation tends not to have like a really nice, good reputation. One of the problems with documentation is that it's out of date, and this is something that docs as code really addresses very well, this problem. So taking a step back, docs as code refers to the philosophy that you should be writing documentation with the same tools as your code. So if you're using continuous development, you should be using continuous development with your documentation. If you're using something like Python, if you're using JavaScript, then you should also be using those tools to create your documentation. So we have continuous integration. And so if you are a JavaScript developer, you are probably familiar with Prettier, and Prettier is great for taking opinions about how you should format your code and putting it into a formatter that acts like a linter so that you can stop these arguments and you can just use Prettier in order to make sure that these opinions are actually expressed in the code. You can add automation with GitHub Actions. And finally, there's Veil. So if you are a technical writer, you're probably aware of having a writer's style guide. A style guide is a good step in terms of great documentation. It takes different styles, takes your different philosophies about what you want and how you want things written, and it puts it into a linter. This is really important because many people touch the documentation, so you can have like the help center, you can have developers, and you also have technical writers. And in many organizations, they have like different styles of writing. So Veil just like has a standard writing style, and instead of looking up what that writing style is in a style guide, you actually have a linter. And this is something that you can automate using GitHub Actions. I check it out, it's great. There's also continuous delivery. So you have Git. Beyond Git being great for continuous integration, Git is really good in terms of accountability. As I mentioned in the last slide, you have many people touching the documentation. You have the help center, you have your developers, and you also have the writers. So it's really important to figure out when the documentation was written and who wrote it. So that's where Git blame is great. But documentation for Git is really great for continuous integration, because when you're writing docs, you don't want publishing to be a rare event. That's where Netlify comes in at. You can publish your docs on Netlify. Like 20, 30 years ago, when it came to deploying code, something that happened maybe on a quarterly basis if you were ambitious. But now, when it comes to deploying code, it happens on a regular basis. And this is a practice that is really good for documentation. You want to make sure that you are shipping docs as often as possible, and you want to make sure you have continuous integration. You want to make sure that if there's a problem with the documentation or if it's out of date, that being able to update it, being able to change it, you want a low barrier. You don't want a special event to trigger you to update the documentation. That's where Git and Netlify really makes it easy for all parties to take the docs and to make it a continuous work in progress. Make it living. If you're curious about what docs as code looks like in practice, I would check out Nathan's article. Nathan works at Linode, and he talks about the motivation behind why to adopt docs as code and exactly like what is their workflow. So I think that's a really good resource. So you have the written documentation part down, the written part, but there's some people who are visual learners. What do you do about your readers who rather be watching watching something, or they like their documentation to be rich and heavy with images? That's all great, but as you know, images take up over 60% of a website's total bandwidth. So you want documentation that has videos and images, but you also care about performance, and you don't want your documentation to be compared to this humble slug. So that's where Gatsby comes in at. So Gatsby has a plugin, a Cloudinary plugin. For those of you who don't know about Cloudinary, it's a great way to manage your assets. So you can compress your videos, you can compress your images, you can also make transformations. And the great part about the Gatsby Cloudinary plugin is that you don't need a context switch. You can use Cloudinary's plugin within Gatsby, and you don't have to go from your app, your documentation site written in Gatsby to Cloudinary. You can just use Cloudinary using the plugin, so it's very convenient. Another way that Gatsby helps you is the Gatsby Image API. So the Gatsby Image API, let's say that you have you want fluid, you have like different screen sizes. Like you have phone, you have like a regular computer and an iPad. You want to make sure that your images looks okay on all devices. And in the past, I know for me, I had to write separate CSS media queries. But with the Gatsby Image API, it does that hard work for you. So you can just put in an image and it will resize the image based on the user's device. So that's definitely taking that off your plate. And I'm really excited to know more about the new features and functionality in the Gatsby Image API. And finally, MDX. So MDX, you can add JSX, and it's really great because if you've worked with Markdown, Markdown is convenient, but Markdown can be really limiting. With MDX, you can actually add buttons, you can add components. It really makes MDX a rich experience. So if you're curious about MDX and what you can do with MDX, I suggest going to the MDX website, going to the playground, and just like adding components and just like experimenting. Documentation SEO. So nice, but nobody knows about us. You're putting like a lot of time into writing good docs, writing clear docs, YouTube videos. They take a really long time to create, but if you're putting all this energy into your documentation, you have to make sure that it's discoverable too. So here's Maslow's hierarchy of SEO needs. Maslow creates products, and they create a lot of great blog posts about SEO. So you have in his chart, crawl accessibility, that's important, and then you have snippet and schema markup. I'm not going to go through all of these, but what I like is if you're using Gatsby, that it covers most of what is in this pyramid. So there's a Gatsby SEO component. If you download Gatsby's Getting Started blog, they actually have this SEO component, and the SEO component does a lot of the hard work for you. So here is the HTML markup of the Gatsby SEO page. And in the HTML document, you have meta. And meta tags are basically like the metadata of your HTML document. And this is something that Gatsby's SEO component takes care of for you. So if you're looking at the SEO component has something called Helmet. And Helmet puts in all that metadata into your app. This is important because when you're working with static generated sites, sometimes the information is not crawled by Google, and this is a problem because if you don't have Google crawling your site, then it's not giving the key information it knows to like rank your site. Another key portion of what we're looking at here is when you're working with the SEO, Gatsby's SEO component, you have like, this is a Twitter card, and you also have something called Open Graph. SEO is very important. That's how a lot of people actually find websites, and that includes like your documentation site. So the SEO component is great in terms of making sure that your site looks good and shows up on social media. So once again, worldwide, there's like 2.77 billion social media users. So that's something that really shouldn't be overlooked when you're distributing your documentation. One thing that I really like using is the Twitter card validator. So if you filled out your Gatsby SEO component correctly, then you can put your documentation URL under card URL, and it will show you the image, and it will also show you the title and body. I like using Twitter card validator just to know what my tweet will look like before putting it out there. So I think it's a really useful tool. And once again, if you're doing everything correctly in the SEO component, then you don't have to worry about having missing information in your tweet. If you're curious about the sources in this presentation, I put it in 3 different sections. So there's docs as code, there's working with videos and images, there's documentation and robust SEO. So thank you very much. Once again, my name is Portia. On Twitter, you can find me at Agency Cecile, GitHub, PCafe, that's my website. And this has been a pleasure. Thank you.